ویدیو فارسی تقدیم می کند.
Well, I've been in the British Museum for 17 years, but before that I was living in the Middle East, in Bahrain, and before that I had been educated in the United States and had worked in a variety of museums there. But from my first museum job there, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, I became interested in Islamic art and just kind of never looked back after that. Well, the British Museum's Islamic collection begins with the start of the British Museum in 1753. And some of our most interesting things in this collection are from Hans Sloane, who was the founder of the museum. He acquired the library of a German doctor who had traveled to Iran and then on to Japan in the late 17th century, and so we have an album that was made for this, Engelbert Kempfer was his name, made for this man, with pictures of all the different kinds of people who lived in Isfahan and all the different kind of animals that were in Iran and things like that. So it's really, you know, documents like these that are so important. Then after that, other objects came into the collections, and Islamic things came from the excavations that the museum did in the Near East. Now, of course, the aim of most of those early excavations was to find ancient material, things from the ancient or biblical world. But of course, the upper levels were Islamic, and so they kept those things, and today they are very valuable for having been excavated in places like Ctesiphon or Ephesus or places like that.
The V&A was set up in 1852 after the Great Exhibition, and the people who established it included Owen Jones, who was probably the leading expert on Islamic art in Britain at the time, and they were seeking to find models for British designers and to educate British taste, because they felt that British design and British taste weren't good enough to compete in international markets. One of the themes we try to bring out in the gallery is that when the Islamic Empire was formed in the 7th and 8th centuries, Islamic art didn't appear miraculously all at one time, but it developed gradually out of the artistic traditions of the states that existed before. In terms of the Middle East, the important ones are the late Roman and Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sasanian state in Iraq and Iran in the east. And you can see many of the traditions from those places that carry on.
In the coinage, for example, until the late 7th century, you still have the old coinage being used with Arabic writing, and then it's reformed and it all changes. In the Dome of the Rock, you have these beautiful decoration in mosaic where there are sort of references to Sasanian motifs, and yet there are Arabic inscriptions around, and also no human forms. And so already in 691 or 2 or whatever it is, at the end of the 7th century, you're beginning to get a shift towards something that becomes definably Islamic and obviously not Sasanian or not Byzantine. And I think it's really, though, under the Abbasids that it all takes hold.
At the beginning of the Islamic period, the Islamic Middle East formed part of more or less formed part of a single state. There were bits at the edges that fell off, but it was an enormous state that stretched from the Atlantic to the banks of the Indus River in South Asia. So you have this huge area, and of course it produced lots of taxes. And as it was a unitary state, this taxation was funneled towards the centre. And so you see the most important artistic developments taking place first of all in Syria, in Damascus. But then in 750, the caliphate, that is the institution that ruled the Islamic Empire, there was a change of dynasty in a revolution in 750, and the centre was moved to Iraq, and cities like Baghdad were founded as the capitals of the caliphs. And so then it was Iraq that became the key area. And Iraq had actually been part of the Sasanian Empire, which was, in other words, it had been run by Iranians. And it's really in Iraq that the main impetus towards a different, separate, distinctive Islamic art takes place. And it takes place in a context that is very heavily influenced by Iranian pre-Islamic traditions. But it soon becomes something quite different through all these changes.
With their building new capitals like Baghdad and then Samarra, and wanting to really stamp a new style on an identity, then this new style really comes into its own. And what happens is that while you have certain basic patterns in terms of architecture, say, that remain useful in places, there are stylistic add-ons that have come from the Abbasid sort of center, the capital, that go out. And so we find things. You know, in Balkh, you find, in Afghanistan, you'll find a mosque type that actually reflects a type of mosque that was only in Baghdad. Or in Cairo, in the mosque of Ahmad ibn Tulun, you find this ziggurat-type minaret that really is copying the one in Samarra. So there's a lot of awareness at the higher levels, anyway, in the 8th, 9th century of what was going on in the center. They wanted to copy the big boys, I guess, the caliph. And that's how things seem to spread and change. And the means of changing things, I suppose, were what they were trading, textiles and other types of objects that then were copied in other places. I suppose the first Islamic art appears in Jerusalem. I mean, the Dome of the Rock is the first great Islamic monument. So that's the Umayyad period. And the Umayyads have castles in Jordan. So they are the first ones. You don't, I mean, Iran comes a bit later. And Egypt, you know, there's a mosque of Amr ibn al-As, but it's really very much restored. It's hard to say. And Kairouan, you know, there are a few early sites, but the Dome of the Rock is where, you know, for us, that's sort of the starting place. And of course, coins. Coins start right away. Well, I think the Umayyads begin, and you have Mashata. I mean, in Berlin, there's this whole facade of Mashata, and that's really interesting because it takes, again, a kind of late antique set of forms, and they're slightly different and slightly you know, there's something different about them. They're placed in these sort of very fierce triangular frames and things like that. And so you start getting, with the Umayyads, an attempt to break away from the past and to incorporate ideas from the past into something new. But the Abbasids are the ones who kind of pull it all together. But it did begin before them.
Perhaps one of the most obvious changes that takes place between the Umayyad and the Abbasid periods is that in Syria there's a very strong tradition of building in stone, whereas in Iraq and Iran the tradition is building in brick of various types.
Say you take the 15th century, well, you have the Mamluks, and so they're controlling Syria and Egypt, and you have the Timurids in Iran, and a variety of people in Anatolia. I mean, they're Ottomans, but they're not controlling all of Anatolia, and the sort of remainder of the Seljuks and various people in Anatolia. But if you take the Mamluks versus the Iranians, there is quite a difference, I'd say, in style, and they're both quite spectacular. But Iranian art has always had a bigger place for human imagery and animal imagery, and so that goes on and on and on, whereas the Mamluks seem to be much more interested in inscriptions and flowers and not so much human and animal imagery.
When you come into the Jamil Gallery, one of the introductory displays shows the different types of pattern and motifs used in Islamic art, just to give people some sort of framework they can begin to understand it within. And there are the elements that we've picked out, and which it's very common to pick out, usually in relation to earlier Islamic art rather than the art after 1500, is that there's calligraphy is a key element. In other words, the Arabic script was refined to a level where it could be used as a decorative element in all sorts of media, as well as writing on paper and carving inscriptions in stone. So you find it in textiles and tile work and all sorts of media. There's also a display on the use of plant-based motifs. Plant-based motifs were commonly used for decorative arts in antiquity, both in the Mediterranean world, where you had late Roman and Byzantine art, but also in the Eastern Islamic world in terms of Iran, where you had the Sasanian Empire with an art that also used lots of plant-based motifs. And those were taken up by Islamic art, I mean by the people producing it, and they were abstracted, and often the patterns are based on quite strict geometrical principles. And you also see in medieval Islamic art a widespread use of geometric patterns, which are also drawn from the pre-Islamic period in terms of their origins, but they were developed into quite complex forms. So you have a sort of symmetry and regularity of pattern, which is seen both in these rectilinear patterns, but also in other patterns, like the ones based on plants. And I think that those patterns are there because they're rich and expensive, and they tell people that about the generosity and wealth of the patron, but also they represent a sense of order in the world, because and I think they're linked more to the political system in the Islamic world rather than to the religious one. People often say that they have very strong cosmic symbolism, but actually it's very noticeable that in the medieval period, for example, people didn't write works which explain these patterns in terms of cosmic symbolism. And as an art historian, you don't make things up because they seem nice. you actually rely on the things that people said at the time in order to explain patterns. And there's a complete silence from the medieval world about any cosmic significance for these patterns.